Good morning, everyone. How's everybody doing? Still on? Hello? Good morning. Yes? Is some of you tired this morning? It looks like some of us didn't make it all the way down here this morning. Just checking in. Okay. You guys having a good conference? Okay. A couple of quick reminders. We wanted to let you know it's in your. Many of these things are actually in your. I'm blanking on the word. Thank you on your program, and just a reminder that Southeast Regional is coming up. It's in New Orleans this year. Is that correct? Yes. Also we have a raffle after this. After Dr. James speaks, we have a raffle, and then later on today we have the 2-night stay raffle. So make sure you're sticking around for those kinds of things. And so with no further ado, I'm going to go ahead and introduce Dr. James. Mark James is an associate professor of applied linguistics. He's the director of undergraduate studies in the MA TESOL program and an advisor in the English department in Arizona State University, where he teaches a variety of undergraduate courses. Dr. James's research deals with issues related to curriculum, teaching, learning, and second language education, in particular the practical and theoretical aspects of learning transfer. And I've been talking to him over the last day or so, and he was showing me something earlier, which I'd never thought of it that way, so hopefully you'll have the same effect that it had on me when I watched it earlier. And so, with no further ado, Dr. James.
Thanks, James. Okay. Great. Yeah. Thanks, everyone. Good morning. Okay. Saturday morning. All right. Yeah. Thanks very much for the nice introduction. And I'd like to start by just saying thank you very much to the conference organizing committee for inviting me to give this presentation. This is my first time joining a Sunshine State TESOL conference. So it's a pleasure to be part of an event that has obviously been successful and important, given that it's in its 36th year. It's great getting to visit this part of Florida again, too. When I was a student in the K through 12 school system in Canada, a ritual for many families was to get away from the cold winter weather for a break in the Florida sunshine. And my family spent a few vacations around St. Petersburg. So they were interested to hear that I would be coming for another visit this week. So we were all pretty excited about me coming here, but now that I'm here, I have to confess that I'm also a little relieved, because things almost fell apart at the last minute. I had booked my flight about a month ago, which I was really happy about because I usually do these things in a bit more of a rush. And since booking the ticket, I had been confidently assuring the conference organizing committee that everything was under control. I was all set. And I guess I had assured myself pretty well too, because somehow I got busy with other things and I neglected to look at my ticket until just a few days ago, the day before my flight. I was looking for the departure time so I could figure out what time I had to get to the airport to leave Phoenix, and was horrified to realize that the ticket I had booked was to the wrong destination. Now, I've never been to Orlando before, and I'm sure it's a very nice place. Maybe it's not too hard for someone who has mistakenly flown there to get to here, but those were not the first thoughts in my head when I discovered my mistake. And I spent the next hour in a panic, sweating, and scrambling to change my ticket. And it didn't help that my wife was watching and found this whole thing hilarious. So as you can imagine, I'm very happy to have made it here. And I'd like to say one more big thank you to everyone in the audience this morning for being here too. I know your time is valuable and I appreciate you spending it this way. Anyhow, my plan this morning is to speak for about 50 minutes, so we'll have some time for questions. Let me also point out that I haven't prepared a handout for the presentation because I'll put my PowerPoint slides and an audio recording of this presentation on my website after the conference. The website address is up here, and I'll put it up again at the end of the presentation. As for the topic of the presentation, as you can see from the title, we'll be focusing on transfer of learning, or learning transfer, in ESOL education. When I saw that the general theme of this year's conference is charting new waters, TESOL for the next generation, I thought that this topic is in many ways a good fit. With the analogy of charting new waters, the theme points to the importance of being able to successfully navigate new situations. And that's exactly what learning transfer deals with. So let's take a closer look at this topic, and we'll do so by considering 4 key questions. What is learning transfer? Why is learning transfer important in ESOL education? What kind of learning transfer, if any, occurs in ESOL education? And what can ESOL educators do to help promote learning transfer? So let's start with the first question. What is learning transfer? And we're going to start to answer this question by taking a quick look at a very famous education context, the Hogwarts School of Witchcraft and Wizardry. I was relaxing last week watching a Harry Potter movie. Thank you for not laughing at that. And one of the scenes jumped right out at me because it illustrates what we are talking about. In this scene, Harry and his classmates have just returned from summer vacation to start their 5th year at Hogwarts. They're having their first class of the year in a course called Defense Against the Dark Arts, which is a course that focuses on the use of defensive spells. They've taken this course in previous years, but they're going to have a new teacher this year, and this is their first session with a new teacher. And this clip is about 2 minutes long. So although no one uses the word transfer in this clip, that's exactly what it's all about. Harry and his classmates are puzzled by the new curriculum in this course because it won't involve any practice of spells. When they ask the teacher, she explains that they only need to develop a theoretical knowledge so they can pass the upcoming exams. But Harry hits the nail on the head when he asks, and how is theory supposed to prepare us for what's out there? Harry is deeply worried that learning about spells in this particular course is not going to help him when he comes up against his archenemy, Lord Voldemort, outside school. In other words, Harry is worried that although he and his classmates may learn about defensive spells in this course, that learning may not transfer to other situations. In more general terms, then, learning transfer, the topic of this presentation, refers to the application of learning in new situations. This includes applying what we have learned in a course on spells when we are actually fighting an evil wizard. It also includes countless other situations, like when someone who has learned how to drive a car then applies that learning when driving a truck for the first time. Or when someone who has learned how to play guitar then applies that learning when trying to play piano for the first time. Or when someone who has learned math at school then applies that learning when she or he goes shopping. So now that we have an understanding of what learning transfer is, an obvious follow-up question is why learning transfer is important in ESOL education. Let me start to answer this question by looking a little more broadly at education in general. Formal education of any type rests on an expectation that learning will transfer. For example, in many countries around the world, children are required to spend years in the school system, and to justify this massive investment of a society's resources and an individual's time, there's obviously an expectation that time spent in the school system will impact students' lives in some way beyond school. For example, when they're at home or in the community, or when they've left school to enter the workforce, and so on. And even as students move within a school system, there's an expectation that learning will have an impact. For example, from one math course to the next, or from a year's worth of classes to an end-of-year set of examinations. In fact, that's what we saw in the example from Hogwarts. Although that teacher was not interested in promoting transfer to the world beyond the school, she was very interested in promoting transfer to the end-of-year exams. Now, expectations for transfer may be explicit, for example, included in a mission statement or in a list of goals in a curriculum document, or these expectations may be only implicit. But either way, formal education systems do rest on expectations or assumptions that classroom learning can and will transfer within and beyond those systems. With that in mind, educators in any subject area should be concerned about transfer. But ESOL education is an area in which we should be paying particular attention to transfer, because ESOL learners often have relatively immediate needs to use what they're learning. Many of us teach courses for adults with a focus on English for settlement purposes, like finding a place to live or a job. Many of us teach courses for students in elementary, secondary, or post-secondary schools, with a focus on English for academic purposes, like finding key points in a chapter in a social studies textbook, or writing a report in a science class. Now, if we as ESOL educators could safely assume that what students learn in our courses would transfer when the need arises, then we would not have to pay so much attention to transfer. And this might be quite a reasonable assumption, that learning will lead to transfer. Because as humans, our successful ability to transfer learning is actually closely tied to our evolution. I'm going to show another short video clip that jumped out at me recently from another one of my favorite shows, Cosmos.
how to end our cosmic solution. We had to figure it all out for ourselves. Best thing that was intelligence, especially our need for pattern recognition, sharper beyond evolution. The ones who are good at spotting prey and predator, telling poison falls to nourishing ones, better chance to live and reproduce. We survive and pass on machines for pattern recognition. It's obvious and magic. Culture all over the planet look up at the same stars and found different pictures there. We use this to recognize the patterns in nature, to read the calendar in the sky. The message written in the songs told our forefathers' mothers to agitate and what to move on. When the migratory birds and the rains are cold, they lay the seas for a time.
I don't know how relevant those images of snow would be to Florida, but anyway, you get the idea. Right, so although he doesn't use the term transfer, what Neil deGrasse Tyson is talking about here, when he refers to our ability to recognize patterns in the world around us, is in fact transfer. So we should be pretty good at this because it's actually in our DNA. But let's take a closer look at this idea with a little demonstration. I'm going to put an image up on the screen, and I'd like you to just look at it and try to figure out what it is, but don't say anything. So don't say anything, but if you think you know what this is, just raise your hand silently so we can get a sense of how many people have identified this object. I'm guessing about 10 people. Okay? Right, so now I'm going to add a little information. So now, how many people think they know what the black and white image on the left side of the screen is? Please raise your hand. At least half of us, okay? A lot more than at first. Okay. We'll do another one. Again, please just look at it and try to figure out what it is, but don't say anything. So, just a show of hands, how many people think they know what this is? A little bit more. I'd say probably 25 people, something like that. Okay. I'm going to add a little more information. So now, how many people think they know what the black and white image on the left side of the screen is? I think the extra information helped a little. If there's a few more hands. Okay, so now I'm going to, just in case you still don't know, I'm going to add a little bit more. You can see the red outline. All right? Okay. Just one more, and that'll be enough for the demonstration. Here's a picture of something that is very common. So don't say anything, but if you think you know what the object inside the yellow box is, please raise your hand. Maybe 10 people. Okay? And here's a little help. So now, how many people think they know what the object inside the yellow box is? I hope this is all of us, but it doesn't look like it is. Okay. Anyway, there's certainly a lot more think they know what that object is after I've added some information. So that's it for the pictures, but what exactly does this show? Well, when I put up the first slide for each of these three objects, many of us did not know what they were. Now, we all have learned in the past what a frog is, what a cow is, and what a nose is. We look at a nose every day in the mirror, right? We just didn't transfer that learning when we were first trying to identify the objects on the slides. Having a little more information for each of the objects helped, because many of us then suddenly made connections. So basically, the circumstances had to be just right for us to transfer our learning about frogs, cows, and noses. So despite the fact that an ability to transfer learning is, as Neil deGrasse Tyson explained, one of our strengths as a species, it isn't something that we can take for granted. In other words, we can't assume that learning inevitably leads to transfer. And this is exactly what a huge body of research on learning transfer in educational psychology has showed. For example, in one of the most famous early studies of transfer, over 100 years ago, Thorndike and Woodworth had a group of people practice estimating the area of rectangles. Through the training sessions, the participants were able to improve their ability to estimate the areas of rectangles. But when they were then tested on estimating the areas of a larger range of rectangles, and estimating the areas of other shapes like circles, triangles, and squares, they didn't do as well as they had during training. So the researchers concluded that the participants' learning didn't freely transfer. And this is reflected in the centuries' worth of research on learning transfer since then. Findings have collectively shown that while learning can transfer, it often doesn't. And this will not come as a surprise to many of us, because of our own experience in the classroom. As teachers, we may have our own examples of situations in which we've seen students have difficulty transferring what they've learned. In one nice example I read about recently, a physics professor said that his students had successfully learned in class how to calculate how long it would take a ball to fall to the ground from the top of a tower. But when the students then had a test question asking them to calculate how long it would take a ball to fall to the bottom of a well, students complained that they hadn't been given any questions about wells in class. So it's clear that learning transfer is important in ESOL education because of the immediate needs that ESOL students have to apply what they learn, and because we can't assume that students will transfer ESOL learning. So we may be wondering now if there is any hope for us as ESOL teachers. Well, I can share some good news. Recently, I've looked pretty closely at one big branch of ESOL education, English for Academic Purposes Instruction, to see what the answer to this question might be. This has been an interesting branch to look at for a couple of reasons. First, EAP instruction often occurs right before or while the student is in the academic courses or programs taught in English. So it's pretty easy to see the importance of transfer. Second, there's quite a bit of research that has looked at the impact of EAP instruction. And that research sheds some useful light on this question. So I'll talk for a few minutes now about what we've learned from that research. First, we know in general that EAP learning can transfer. A number of studies have produced evidence that students transfer learning from EAP courses to work in other courses. And this research has been done in a range of EAP contexts, including colleges and universities in Australia, Bahrain, Canada, New Zealand, and the US. For example, some studies have examined students' academic records and have shown that students who took a particular EAP course had significantly better GPAs and graduation rates than students who did not take that course. And this shows that something transferred from the EAP course. The second thing we know is that a variety of kinds of EAP learning can transfer. This includes learning related to reading, writing, listening, speaking, and academic study skills in general. For example, the ability to manage time, to find sources, to prepare for tests, and to conduct analyses. And third, if we expand our view and look at research that has provided evidence of EAP students transferring learning not just across courses, but also across activities, we can build up an even more detailed picture of transfer in EAP education, giving us a sense of the specific circumstances under which EAP learning transfers. We can see, for example, that when EAP learning transfers, it can have a positive impact on the quality of a student's work. This includes, for example, transfer that leads to students getting a higher score on a vocabulary or grammar test, or a higher score on a reading or listening comprehension test, or making a smaller number of mistakes in an essay. Excuse me. But an improvement in quality isn't the only kind of impact transfer can have. And we know less about whether transfer has an impact on students' speed when they're doing academic work. For example, how much reading they can do in a given amount of time, or how fluently they can speak. And we also know less about whether transfer has an impact on students' approach to doing academic work. For example, whether they use certain kinds of strategies, like listening or speaking strategies, when they're doing their academic work. We can also see that when EAP learning transfers, it is sometimes prompted in the sense that activities provide explicit hints to students about what they should transfer. For example, if students are asked to complete a grammar or vocabulary test that is in multiple choice format, it's relatively obvious to the students that they are supposed to try to transfer something that they learned previously about grammar or vocabulary. And as a result, this kind of transfer is relatively easy because it is simply a matter of recognizing something on a provided list of choices. But we also have plenty of evidence of EAP students transferring learning in a more spontaneous way, in activities that are open-ended and do not provide explicit hints about what the students should transfer. For example, when students are asked to write an essay or to participate in a group discussion, and they are not given any more specific instructions than that, if transfer occurs in these situations, it's relatively spontaneous, because students have had to work out for themselves what learning they can transfer. And this is an important distinction because spontaneous transfer is more difficult than transfer that's prompted. And one last thing we can see is that when EAP learning transfers, it can occur across varying distances. What this means is that EAP learning can transfer when the learning situation and the transfer situation are similar. For example, when they occur around the same time, or in the same place, or when they deal with the same kind of subject matter, or when the activities have a similar format. In these cases, when transfer occurs, we can call it near transfer because of these similarities between the situations. But EAP learning can also transfer when there are important differences between the learning situation and the transfer situation. For example, when these situations are separated by several weeks or months, or when these situations involve working with different subject matter, or in different locations with different people, or they involve different kinds of activities. In these cases, when transfer occurs, we can call it far transfer because of these differences across the situations. So we know that EAP learning can transfer across different distances. And this is important because far transfer is typically more difficult than near transfer. But we'd still like to learn more about transfer distance and EAP learning because most of the transfer we've seen is relatively near. So we don't know much about whether EAP learning transfers to situations that are far in lots of different ways. So based on the research that's currently available, it's clear that EAP learning, and by extension ESOL learning, can transfer under a variety of circumstances. We still have a lot to learn about transfer, but I think the picture that we currently have is positive, and it gives us ESOL educators a lot to work with. So I strongly recommend that we do not give up yet and quit our jobs because we think that promoting transfer is hopeless. It's not. And we have lots of evidence that it can occur. But just because it can occur doesn't mean that it will. So it makes sense for us to do whatever we can to try to help promote transfer with our ESOL students. With that in mind, I'm going to spend the rest of my time this morning talking about this question. What can ESOL educators do to help promote learning transfer? A general answer to this question is that we can try to make our courses as conducive to transfer as possible. That sounds fine, but how exactly do we do that? Well, there are specific concrete things we can do. And I'm going to demonstrate this by taking a close look at one important aspect of many ESOL courses, the course textbook. Textbooks play a central role in many ESOL courses, and they have a strong influence on the teaching and learning that go on in those courses. So it makes sense that if we are trying to make our courses as conducive to transfer as possible, we want to find books and use books in ways that will help us to achieve this. And to do that, it's helpful to be able to evaluate a given textbook's potential to help promote transfer. So I'm going to walk us through an example evaluation using a tool that I created recently for practical use by teachers. The tool is just this set of questions that you can see up here. And I know it's quite small, but we will look at its parts one by one on the next few slides. And it's designed to bring together current ideas about how teaching can help promote transfer. So you'll see that some of the questions are about the kind of practice students would get. And other questions are about the kind of abstract thinking that students would do. And that's because we know that there are two main ways that transfer can occur. Automatically, which we can promote through practice, and intentionally, which we can promote through abstract thinking. So you may notice these patterns as we work through the evaluation. And since we're going to take a closer look at each of these parts now, just keep in mind that overall, this tool involves answering questions in two steps. Basically, step one asks, what are students supposed to learn in a textbook? What are they supposed to learn? Step two asks, in a few different ways, how are they supposed to learn that? So we'll take a closer look. And I know this is small. This is all going to be available on my website, so we can take a closer look after if you want to. And I'll describe this in as much detail as I can so that if you're at the back, you can keep up with what we're looking at here. Okay. So I'm going to demonstrate the evaluation tool by walking through an evaluation that I did of parts of 5 commercial textbooks, which you can see in the orange or yellow column on this table on the left side. This table is actually the complete results of the evaluation. So we're going to work our way across the table, across these columns, and I'm going to flip back and forth to show examples of what I'm talking about here. The 5 books that I chose, which are Four Corners, Global, Life, Network, and Speak Out, may be familiar to some of you. They were from the online catalogs of 5 major publishers of ESOL textbooks. And I chose them just because I thought they would be familiar to a lot of us. They are all aimed at adults at an intermediate level of ability, and they are all integrated skills textbooks with attention to each of the main language skills. The parts I analyzed were single units that the publishers make available for download. So there are 2 steps in evaluating these sample units. Step 1 asks, by the end of the unit, what should students be able to do? So here we're trying to identify transferable outcomes explicitly targeted in the units. And we can do this by looking for statements about what students should be able to do as a result of having completed the unit. These kinds of statements can often be found in a scope sequence chart at the beginning of a book, or in the introduction to a unit, or part of a unit, or in the teacher's guide. And in the second, the highlighted column on this table, the second column, these are the transferable outcomes, some of the transferable outcomes explicitly targeted in the units that I focused on. And I'll just read them quickly for you. So in the first book, students will be able to talk about what they would like to do. In the second row, the second book, students will be able to make offers and decisions. In the third row, the third book, students will be able to talk about an illness. In the fourth one, students will be able to name and describe different jobs. And in the last one at the bottom, students will be able to talk about a life change. Okay, now for each of the units, there were multiple outcomes. And a teacher could evaluate a unit by looking at each of the outcomes in that unit, or by looking at only those that would be most important in that teacher's context. For our purposes today, just to illustrate how this tool can be used, I've chosen just one outcome from each of these units, and those are the ones that I read to you. I chose these outcomes because collectively they illustrate most of the transfer promoting characteristics that one might look for when evaluating ESOL materials. So we'll move on to step 2, and we'll take a look at the ways that these units look like they will help to promote the transfer of these target outcomes. So for each targeted outcome, the first question in step 2 asks how the unit makes clear to students that they can apply the target outcome beyond the ESOL classroom. And this is important because if a unit does not make this clear, students are being left to work out on their own that transfer is possible. And that reflects an assumption that learning naturally leads to transfer, which research shows is not the case. And in this column, we can see that for most of the outcomes, this is done passively. Now what I've done here, there's a P or an A in the column for each of these books. P means passively, A means actively. So it's P for the first one, A for the second one, P for the third one, P for the fourth one, and P for the fifth one. Almost all are Ps. So yeah, for most of these, it's a P, and that means that the unit includes signals like pictures or headings that point to situations beyond the ESOL classroom in which the target outcomes can be transferred. For example, the first target outcome here is talking about what one would like to do. And the unit in that book includes an example of such a conversation. And as you can see here, this is an excerpt from the book. The conversation is accompanied by a picture of the two people talking, and they're in a kitchen. So obviously they're not in an ESOL classroom. So hopefully students will pick up on this signal about where transfer could occur. But transfer possibilities can be made clear to students in more active ways too, and that's why one of the books had an A in that column. By asking students to think themselves about where transfer might occur. It's the second one here. For example, the second target outcome in our list is making offers and decisions. And the unit includes an activity in which students have to listen to recordings of conversations and match them to situations like, you are in a train station cafe with a friend, or you work in a ticket office. So the students have to think about situations beyond the ESOL classroom where these examples of making offers and decisions could be encountered. The second question in step 2 asks how the unit demonstrates the target outcomes. It's about demonstration. This is important because it's more difficult for students to transfer something that they've only talked about indirectly or in a removed way, rather than directly seen or heard in actual use. So if, for example, we are expecting transfer of speaking skills, a demonstration should include some actual speech. For example, in an audio recording, and not just a written transcript. As this column shows, all 5 of the targeted outcomes are demonstrated. The first one, it's demonstrated in both spoken and written form. The second one, just spoken form. The third one, spoken and written form. The fourth one, spoken and written. The fifth one, spoken and written. For example, for the third outcome, talking about an illness, the unit in question includes not only written examples of statements like, I've got a headache and I've got a sore throat, which are indirect demonstrations of talking about an illness. It also includes audio recordings of conversations between pharmacists and patients, which are direct demonstrations because they're audio recordings. Question 3 is a little more complicated because it has several parts. And this is the first part, which asks how many activities require students to actually practice the target outcome. And this is important because it's more difficult for students to transfer something that they have not had sufficient chance to use themselves. In this column, there are just numbers. Number 7 at the top, 3, 4, 5, and 2. This column shows that for all of the outcomes, there are multiple practice activities. For example, the fourth outcome, near the bottom, is naming and describing different jobs. And that unit includes 5 practice activities, like having students ask what each other does, and having students describe jobs without naming them so that each other can guess what the job is. Next, question 3.1 asks, how many of those practice activities require students to pretend to be in some other situation outside the ESOL classroom? And that's important because transfer is easier when learning occurs in ways that mirror transfer contexts. And one way to do this is to have students practice while pretending to be in situations outside the ESOL classroom. This column, again, just includes numbers. 1, 2, 1, 1, and 0. So this column shows that almost all of the units have at least one such activity. For example, for the first outcome in our table at the top, this is talking about what one would like to do. Here's one activity from the book. This activity has students pretend to be looking out a window at different street scenes. For those of you at the back, there are 3 different pictures. They're scenes of a street, like a neighborhood. The students have to look at these and decide what they would like to do outside. So the situation they are pretending to be in is in someone's house, not in the ESOL classroom. And question 3.2 asks, how many of the practice activities require students to use the target outcome to solve a problem? This is another way we can mirror transfer contexts, where language is usually a means to an end rather than an end in itself. And here, solving a problem means going beyond just giving and gathering information, and instead using information to make decisions or judgments. And this column again has some numbers, 2, 1, 0, 2, 1. And there's a little more information which I'll explain in a second. This column shows that almost all of the units involve at least one problem-solving activity. For example, the 5th outcome at the bottom of the table is talking about a life change. And in that unit, there's one activity in which students are asked to listen to a recording of 2 women talking on a radio program about some major changes they made in their lives. And then to work in pairs to discuss whether they think those changes were good for the women and whether they would make those changes themselves. So the students have to go beyond just exchanging information about the women's life changes, because they have to use this information to make judgments about those changes. And there's one more part of this activity, of this question, I'm sorry. If there are multiple problem-solving activities, it's beneficial if the activities vary. For example, in terms of the content that they involve or the contexts in which they occur. So for example, with the first outcome at the top of the table, there are 2 problem-solving activities, one of which involves pretending to be sitting in someone's living room. We saw those pictures of the 3 street scenes. And the other activity doesn't involve pretending to be anywhere else. Therefore, it's just in the classroom. So the context for those 2 activities differs. And this can help students to see patterns and make connections that will lead to transfer. And that's what the words in those in that column. For a couple of those outcomes, I added a little bit of information. It's just to describe that the activities are they vary. They're not exactly the same, which is a good thing. Question 4 asks what students are required to generalize about related to the target outcome. And generalizing here means thinking of abstract rules, principles, or patterns. This column shows that all of the units involve at least some kind of generalizing related to the target outcome. But this generalizing varies in that some is about language form, some is about language function, and some is about language meaning. And I'll just read quickly so you see what I mean. For the first outcome, form and meaning. For the second one, form and meaning. For the third one, function. The fourth one, form and meaning. The last one, just meaning. Here are 3 examples. The first in the top left, and these are just taken directly from the pages. The first in the top left involves generalizing about form. because it provides students with a collection of sentences in that box. And it asks students to notice patterns in what those sentences look like, specifically which verbs are used. The second example in the top right involves generalizing about function, because it provides students with a collection of sentences and also with general labels that describe what those sentences are used for, like asking and talking about illness and giving advice. And the third example in the bottom right involves generalizing about meaning, because it provides students with a collection of words and with pictures that illustrate the general ideas that those words represent. And something I'd like to just point out quickly before we go on is that all of the examples of generalizing that I found in these units involved generalizing about language products, form, function, and meaning. But that's not the only thing that we might have students generalize about. Besides asking students to look for patterns in those aspects of language, looking at language as a product, we could also ask them to look for patterns in language processes. For example, we could ask students to think of helpful steps to follow in creating an essay or giving a speech, reading an article, or listening to a lecture. Right? Not just as a product, but think about steps you could take. And another important part of this question is how the generalizations are made. Because sometimes generalizations are just given to students, like just giving students a set of example sentences plus a rule that explains the structure of those sentences. And in that case, the generalizing is relatively passive. We're just giving it to the students, and whether they take it up or not, we're not so sure. On the other hand, sometimes students are asked to work out generalizations on their own, like when we give students a set of example sentences and ask them to find patterns, to figure out themselves what the rule is behind the structure of the sentences. And in this case, the generalizing is relatively active. So in the highlighted column, we can see that there was variation in these units, because there's a mixture of P's for passive and A's for active. I'll read down from the top. P, A for the first one, A for the second one, P for the third one, passive. For the fourth one, passive and active. For the fifth one, just active. To illustrate, let's go back to the three examples of generalizing that we just looked at a minute ago. The example in the top right involves passive generalizing, because students are given specific sentences like, I don't feel well, and I feel sick, and drink lots of water. And also, they're given the general functions of these sentences, asking and talking about illness, and giving advice. So, students don't have to work out any connections here. They can just read this. But the example in the top left involves active generalizing, because students are given specific sentences like, I'll carry those books for you, and I'll take the next train. And they're asked to figure out on their own what verbs are used in these kinds of sentences. So the students are being asked to find a pattern in the form of the sentences. And the example in the bottom right is also an example of active generalizing. Here, students are given a collection of specific words, and the students have to match those specific words with pictures that illustrate their general meaning. If the words and meanings were already linked for the students, this would be passive generalizing. But because students have to work out those relationships for themselves, because they have to match, the generalizing is more active. Next, question 5 asks what students are required to analogize about related to the target outcome. Analogizing here means making connections between a target outcome and something else students already know. And these kinds of connections can help to promote transfer. This column is easy for me to read. It's all zeros, except for the bottom. There's one at the bottom for the fifth unit that I looked at, and it says meaning A. Meaning with an A next to it. We can see in this column, though, that analogizing is not required for most of these outcomes. But there is one example. At the bottom of the table for the fifth outcome, talking about life changes, Students are given a rule about the meaning of used to. And here it is. And we can see that it goes a little bit farther in that students are asked which verb tense, present or past simple, wow, has the same meaning as used to. In other words, students are asked to find an analogy between used to, which is the new language point, and another language structure, another verb tense. They're asked to figure out which one used to is similar to. And I don't know how well you guys can see that. It says, look at your examples to question, that part doesn't matter so much, but the rule that they're looking at, they're supposed to read this rule that says, used to describes a habit or situation which was true in the past, but it is not the same now. You can also use the present or the present / past simple with the same meaning. And they're supposed to decide, is it the present or is it the past simple that I can use? Okay? So that's where they're actively, coming up with an analogy, trying to find a connection. And as I said, same thing with generalizing, with the active and passive, same thing applies here. Because they're making a choice themselves, this is an example of active analogizing. There aren't any other examples of analogizing with the 5 outcomes that we're focusing on today, but I would like to point out that analogizing is like generalizing in that it could involve language form, function, and meaning, as well as language processes. And as I just said, it could be passive or active, in that analogies are simply given to students, which would be passive, or active in the sense that, like this example, the students have to find or choose an analogy. Finally, question 6 asks if students have to reflect on their ability to use the target outcomes. And this is important because metacognitive reflection has been linked to transfer. Another easy column, I'll just read it. It says yes, no, yes, yes, no. This column shows that with some of the outcomes, students are asked explicitly to think about their ability. In those 3 cases where it says yes here, this involves being asked to check a box if they think that they can use the target outcome, or to indicate how well they think they can do so. For example, with the 4th outcome, it says at the bottom of one page in that unit, now I can name and describe different jobs. And the students have a choice of 3 boxes to check: not at all, well, or very well. Okay, so having explained where all of the information in this table comes from, we can now talk briefly about what this information means and how it might be used. First, it's apparent that contemporary ESOL teaching materials, like textbooks, can exhibit a range of transfer-promoting characteristics. Collectively, these 5 examples we looked at reflected all of the main characteristics that one might look for. So I think we can conclude first that it is possible for materials to have strong transfer-promoting potential. But that does not mean that all materials have maximized transfer-promoting potential. Here's the same table, and I've added a few highlights just to show that there are some gaps that we could try to fill. This kind of information could be used, for example, by a teacher who will be teaching with one of these units and wants to enhance its transfer-promoting potential. Modifications that could be made include, first, in relation to the, and I'll work from left to right, in relation to the column for question 1 on the left side. For most of the outcomes, there could be a shift from passive to active in terms of pointing out to students that transfer is possible. In other words, we could ask students to actually think for themselves about where transfer could occur. Next, in the column for question 3.1, for the 5th outcome near the bottom of the table, there could be an activity, a supplemental activity, that has students pretend to be in a situation beyond the ESOL classroom. In the column for question 3.2, there could be more problem-solving activities because the numbers were low for all of the books, for all of the units, but especially for the 3rd outcome because it was a 0. So So some kind of problem-solving activity. In the column for question 5, for almost all of the outcomes, students could be encouraged to analogize. And in the column for question 6, for the second and fifth outcomes, students could be explicitly encouraged to self-reflect on their ability to use those targeted outcomes. So together, these are all ways that the transfer promoting potential of these units could be strengthened for these target outcomes. And being able to see exactly where a unit could be supplemented like this could be pretty useful for a teacher who's going to be using a unit. But another scenario in which a teacher might be able to use this kind of information is when choosing a book for a course. If a teacher has this information for 2 or 3 units from whatever books are under consideration, it would be easy to take a quick look at a table like this and compare the books. The comparison might show that the gaps in one book would be easier to supplement than the gaps in another book. And that could give the teacher meaningful grounds for choosing one book over another. And it's important to keep in mind that the table that I've been describing here today, it includes only one of the target outcomes from one unit in each of these books. I chose these outcomes to talk about today because they do reflect many of the transfer-promoting characteristics that we might look for. But there were other target outcomes in each of these units, and some of them had different gaps, more gaps than these. So the transfer-promoting potential of these textbooks for those outcomes could be enhanced even more. But like we see here, this evaluation tool can show exactly where the gaps are so that efforts can be made to try to fill them. So, starting to wrap things up, I hope that the demonstration has showed that using a materials evaluation tool like this is a practical step that ESOL teachers can take to try to make sure their classes are as conducive to transfer as possible. And I've tried, with a little help from Harry Potter and Neil deGrasse Tyson, to point out here that this is a worthwhile goal. And while on the one hand, we know that ESOL instruction can result in transfer of learning that has a positive impact on students' work and things that they do outside school, at home. On the other hand, we also know that transfer is not an inevitable result of learning. So just because ESOL learning can transfer does not mean it will. So it makes good sense for ESOL educators to do what we can to try to help promote transfer, rather than to just assume that it's going to happen. And one last point I'll make is to call out for more research on this topic. As you saw when I was discussing some of the research on learning transfer in EAP education, we've learned quite a bit, but there are gaps in what we know. For example, about what we know about how far EAP learning will transfer. So, as we are taking steps in a practical sense to try to make our teaching more conducive to transfer, if we can document our efforts by carrying out and publishing research, action research, small scale, large scale, whatever, if we can make efforts to do that, to document our efforts, that work will be of real value not only to our understanding of ESOL education, but to our understanding of second language education more broadly, and even beyond that, to our understanding of effective teaching and learning in general. So that's it for me. There are references there if you want to take a look at the slides afterwards. There's my email address. Please feel free to email me with any questions that I can't answer today. And that's my website where I will upload this recording and the slides when I get back to Phoenix. So please feel free to download things then. Thank you. We have a few. Yes, and we have a few minutes for questions.
Anyone have questions? One around. Yeah, right here. Who has their hand up?
I don't need a microphone. Could you remind us what EAP actually stood for?
Yeah, sure. English for academic purposes. But hey, I mean, our world is full of acronyms, and I know that I lose track of a lot of those. Yeah, that's a good question. So one of the general ideas about teaching for transfer, if we remember one thing from this presentation, I'd say try to remember that there are two general ways that we can try to help promote transfer. One is by making what we do in our classes with our students as similar as possible to what they're going to experience when they're not with us, outside in whatever target context. And the second thing is to try to promote learning in a way that students are thinking about things in abstract ways. So that when there's a learning point, a grammar rule, some new vocabulary words, strategies we want them to learn, that they think about those not just in concrete ways, but also they try to identify patterns. So when we do these two things, right, trying to make our teaching as similar as possible to target situations, that's going to help with this automatic kind of transfer, this reflexive transfer. When we try to encourage students to think about new things in abstract ways, that's going to help with a different kind of transfer, which is a more intentional transfer. It's reflective. And when we do those two things together, we're helping to enhance the possibility of transfer. So what I think you're talking about would be the first of those, the examples, trying to make our class, make our teaching as similar as possible to target situations. And it's going to depend on the context, I think. If we are able to have our students work with examples from the real world or in the real world, I saw, I've seen some interesting examples at some of the presentations that I've been to here of projects, curriculum projects that involve having students not just stay in our classroom, but to go out into the community, right? And I think this is a fantastic way of helping to promote transfer, because we're not just thinking about what examples am I going to bring into the classroom, and we can do that. I mean, some of our contexts might demand that we are thinking only about things that we bring into the classroom. Maybe we can't take students out into the community. So in that case, we do need to think about the authenticity of the examples that we're bringing in. But if we could not only do that, but also have students go out and find examples themselves, maybe even bring those back into the classroom. This is all helping to make what we're doing look similar to what's happening in these target contexts that our students are going to be going out into. So, yeah. Does that answer your question? Yeah? Okay. Thank you.
Other questions?
Lily, there's one over here.
Could you go back to your evaluations, that shows
The questions?
not the questions, just the, so you just look at this one, so I know you're looking at just one outcome for one
Yeah.
chapter.
Yeah.
Would you evaluate one of these as stronger, just based on this chart? And I think what I'm getting at is,
Yeah.
would you, like your questions, would one of them be more valuable, maybe?
Good question. Right, yeah. And you know what I'll do? I'll go to the next slide where I've highlighted what I call the gaps, because it's the same information, but I've just highlighted some gaps here. I've wondered about that as well. Like, looking at this now, would I say that one book is stronger than the other? That's tricky, and I think part of the reason is because I chose these 5 outcomes, and there were many others I could have chosen. I chose these because I wanted to demonstrate a lot of the things that are good, that we would like to see in books. So there actually aren't that many gaps here. If we were evaluating a couple of different outcomes in maybe some different books, we might see a much bigger difference. And I have seen a much bigger difference. So I might see that, the row for one book is full of stuff. The row for the other book has only a couple of things. In that case, it's going to be quite obvious, right? That if I use that second book, I'm going to have to do a lot of supplementing if I'm going to take transfer seriously. In this case, because it's kind of spread out, I don't want to go as far as saying that it's just a matter of counting activities, or like just a checklist. I think there's more to consider here. We have to think about what it is that we're trying to achieve in our class, like what the target outcomes that we're trying to achieve. then we can look at this information and decide if we think that, you know, that there's enough attention to transfer for that particular outcome for our context. I mean, if I'm teaching in a context where some outcomes are more important than others based on my school's curriculum, that's going to have an impact on how I judge the book that I have this information for, because I might find that for some outcomes I can check off all these boxes, for other outcomes I can't, there's some gaps. But the outcome with the gaps is the one that I really want to focus on based on my school's curriculum. So yeah, I think this is really meant to be a descriptive tool to help us to see what's there, and then we can decide, you know, what am I going to have an easier time supplementing? I mean, I might see some gaps here for some of these units that are easier for me to supplement based on my own teaching skills than a different set of gaps for another unit. So yeah, I don't think it's at a point, I would not feel comfortable saying that I think one book is going to be better than the other based on this information. I want to think about how I'm going to supplement based on the gaps that I see, and, you know, do I have that kind of other activities ready that I can supplement and fit into these gaps? I'm going to be thinking about those kinds of things. Yeah. That's a good question, though. Thank you.